So I know it must sound painfully obvious, but how you choose the shutter speed of your exposure plays a tremendous role in the end result of your photo. Of course, a lot of what dictates your shutter speed is the amount of available light, as well as the lens aperture and ISO settings. But I'd argue that the one thing that should dictate your camera's shutter speed should be the subject, or rather, how you want to convey the subject to your viewers. For example, if you want to convey a subject that's normally in motion as crisp and sharp, you'll likely have to use a very fast shutter speed. Or maybe you just want to introduce just a little bit of motion while retaining definition. A great example of that is when you're panning your camera with a moving subject. And then there are times when you just want to glass or ghost out as much motion as possible, in which case you'd probably want to use a really long shutter speed. Ultimately, the decision is yours to make, and in this video, I'd like to share a collection of photos that I've taken over the years to kind of illustrate my approach to shutter speed with the hope of bringing it to the forefront of your mind the next time you're out with your camera. All right, let's dive in. All right, so I have 4 albums. You can actually see them right here for this video. There's fast shutter speeds, kind of slow shutter speeds, and super slow shutter speeds. Now, the whole point of those 4 albums is each one has a certain shutter speed range that I use to determine what I want to convey in terms of how the subject is moving or not moving. There are no hard and fast rules like fast shutter speed has to be, this shutter speed. Generally, fast shutter speed is, for me, something that's like, I would say 1/50th of a second or faster. I would say kind of slow shutter speed for me is anywhere from 1/20th of a second to 2 seconds. A slow shutter speed is anywhere from like, I would say 5 to 30 seconds. And then a super slow shutter speed for me is anything over 30 seconds. So usually you put the camera in bulb mode there and you're shooting for a minute or a couple of minutes. So now that we have the different albums, let me walk you through the images and I'll just kind of show you my rationale. This won't be like an editing session. It's more of kind of compositional tips. I want to do more of these types of videos. And actually, if you are interested in seeing more of these videos, leave a comment below and let me know. All right, let me start with this first image here of these amazing dogs. I actually rode on a sled with these dogs pulling me, but I really wanted to get this particular type of photo as they were running kind of towards me. So you can see that 1/400th of a second is the shutter speed, which I would argue is a pretty fast shutter speed. Now, as you can imagine, these dogs are hustling. I mean, they're booking it through the snow. Even though they've got 2 people behind them, they are very strong and they love doing this. So, in order for me to really kind of snap detail here, I really had to get a fast shutter speed. So, again, just because the subject is moving fast doesn't mean that you can't kind of freeze them. You just have to make sure you get a fast enough shutter speed. And I would also recommend trying to get as many photos as possible while they're going through the frame. Same thing here. So oftentimes when we see clouds, I know for me, I will use a longer shutter speed because I want, especially if the clouds are moving fast, I want to get that motion. But in this particular photo over the Grand Canyon, these clouds were absolutely amazing and they had really nice definition. So given the overall, the scene of the photo, the amount of available light, I ended up going for a 1/2 second, which is kind of, I would say, around the slowest of the fast shutter speeds. I really wouldn't go faster than this, but it did a good enough job of giving me really nice definition in the clouds. I didn't really want to get much definition here, or rather much motion. So, that worked out well here. Same thing here. As you can imagine, these guys, even if I zoom in, you can see the detail is not super, super sharp. But again, when you're looking at it in the proper composition here, you would never notice. But these guys are constantly moving. They're not moving fast, but they are moving, which is why I ended up going with a 1/50th of a second. I could have probably even gotten something a little bit faster, but I was already pretty close to my maximum aperture here. So unless I wanted to jack up the ISO, this is kind of what I settled on. And it worked out well. It did work out well. I'm really happy with this shot. Of course, here, the gondoliers in Venice, Italy, I mean, they're constantly moving. Also, you have the sun that's setting. So if I had a longer exposure, the sun might have gotten a little smudgy. But I ended up going with 1/80th of a second for this. So this is a fast shutter speed. You can see the waves in the water, which is really nice. And of course, the gondolas are nice and sharp here. as well as the gondoliers. Like they're nice and sharp. I didn't want motion. I wanted to show you them in their kind of positions here, the way they're queuing in as the sun's setting to end their days. And then this is one of my favorite examples to show something that's generally moving very fast, but I wanted to freeze it. This is also a great example of scale. So, obviously you have these three people here, and you can get a rough idea of the average height of a person. So you can see how this wave is almost, I would say, 3 times as tall as these people. But I went with 1/200th of a second, and as you can see, did a great job of getting all of that kind of exploding ocean water as it's kind of crashing upward. So if I used any slower of a shutter speed, I mean, it possibly could have looked cool, but I like the fact that everyone was frozen and the water especially was frozen. All right, next up. So I was kind of tracking this little guy right here for a little while. Not a long, I mean, I saw him flying around, and I knew that if I had any hope of getting him kind of in action, I needed a super fast shutter speed. This is with the Zeiss ZX1, which is such a cool little camera. Unfortunately, it was discontinued and wasn't a very successful selling camera, but it was a very cool concept camera, and Zeiss sent it to me to test. And so you can see that this is 1/2500th of a second, very, very fast shutter speed. But because I had that shutter speed, I was able to really snap this little guy over here in flight. And I do love that everything is pretty sharp, like his wings aren't moving a lot. And I think it makes the shot. I love that it's so small. Like odds are if you really weren't looking, you probably would miss it and kind of ask like, what's the point of this photo? So I love that little guy there. And then of course, I mean, a bald eagle is, this guy was sitting here for a little bit, but as you can imagine, birds can fly off whenever they want. So this was 1/640th of a second, also a very fast shutter speed, very high ISO so that I can get this fast shutter speed. This was taken in the afternoon, but it was still not that bright, which is good because I didn't have to deal with any hot spots from the sun. But yeah, this was a pretty fast shutter speed to really lock in the eagle. And so I hope that gives you kind of an idea of when you would want to use a fast shutter speed, or why I used fast shutter speeds. And again, fast shutter speed is just kind of a descriptor. You saw there was a wild range of shutter speeds. It just doesn't mean that everything has to be like 1/2000th of a second. It just has to be fast enough to really freeze whatever the motion is of the subject. And that requires you to look at the subject and figure out, all right, how fast is this thing moving? And what shutter speed do I need based on how fast it's moving to really freeze it? All right, next up is kind of slow shutter speeds. And I have a bunch of images here, so I'll go pretty fast, but I'll explain these to you. Kind of slow shutter speed, I almost always use this when I want to pan with a subject. So this was taken, back in 2012, this racing event. And this is all I wanted to do. I didn't really care so much about taking photos of the race cars when they were static or something. I was just excited to pan here. And so for this particular photo, you would think that this was a really slow shutter speed or something, but it wasn't. It was just 1/25th of a second. Generally, when I'm panning with a subject, I usually try to keep between like 1/20th and 1/30th of a second, maybe 1/15th. Again, depending on how fast the subject is moving and also how fast I'm panning with the subject. So this requires a ton of experimentation. You definitely want to have a big fat SD card because you are going to fill it up quickly with a bunch of photos. But ultimately, you will eventually, hopefully, come up with a cool photo where your subject is sharp, but everything else is really flowing with motion. I think that's super cool. This is the reverse. This is not me panning with the train. This is me allowing this train to kind of come through. This is downtown Portland, Oregon. 1 second exposure. Again, not super slow, not especially fast, but it was just the right amount to get the train. The train obviously was moving at a decent pace. Otherwise, you wouldn't have as much detail here. If it was moving slower, you would probably have a little bit more detail. So this also requires experimentation. Now, this is where I wanted just enough motion in the ocean. I guess that rhymes, but I didn't want it to be glassed out, and I also didn't want it to be super sharp. Part of the reason why I didn't want it to be a super, super long exposure is because I still wanted to retain the detail of the birds up here on these piers. This photo also 1 second. 1 second was chosen because it gave me enough of a shutter speed, or slow enough of a shutter speed, to get motion in these waves here. But you can see this fisherman. I got a little bit of motion in him. You can see his fishing pole. The edge of it is a little soft here. And if we zoom in, you can also see that the top here is also, he was moving a little bit, kind of maybe panning back and forth, or rocking back and forth. But overall, he stayed still long enough. I mean, he obviously didn't know that I was taking his photo, but I thought this was a great shutter speed to get this photo. It has a lot of kind of dynamic elements. Both you have these moving waves, but you also have these really powerful clouds up here. So waterfalls is probably my favorite subject to photograph. And generally, I do operate around the 1/2 second to 2 second mark. Again, it really depends on how much water is flowing, how fast it's flowing, and what sort of obstacles does the water have to go around. So here you can see, because it has all of these little divots here and it has to go around these rocks, a 1/2 second gives me detail in the water. You can see the detail still here. And then also, this water is clearly moving so fast that even at a 1/2 second, it just looks like a solid sheet of water. So this is Antelope Canyon, very, very famous area here. And the shafts of light that come through the slot canyon, they move so fast. It's not even funny, actually. Obviously, the sun's moving through the sky, but you really don't appreciate how fast this light moves until you're standing here and you're actually seeing it kind of cut through your frame. And so for this, I ended up going for a 1/5 of a second. It was enough where I got good detail without blowing out these highlights. I was able to recover some of the shadows, but also, most importantly, you can kind of see the swirls of sand. Again, I told you with waterfalls, I usually go for about a 1/2 second. This is no exception. This is actually the cover of my book that was published back in 2015 called The Visual Palette. This is my good buddy Brian Bonham and his famous calves. But at a 1/2 second, one, that was probably just long enough for my overly caffeinated friend to stand still, while also getting enough detail of the waterfall. Again, panning, one of my favorite things. Depending on the subject matter, this is 1/40th. Usually, like I said, between 1/20th and 1/40th of a second is my happy place for this kind of stuff. But it worked out really well because you can see this guy here, his face, you can see the detail there, but everything in the background is blurred out. And so it just makes for a very cool photo. This was taken in, Havana, Cuba. This is a fun juxtaposition of motion versus stationary objects. This is in Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, Japan. And I took this was 2/5 of a second, which was, I guess, slow enough to get all of these fast pedestrians. I believe this is the world's busiest pedestrian crosswalk. It is wild. If you've never been here, I highly recommend it. But I just love how this dude is standing here. He's got his phone on a selfie stick. He's doing his thing. Standing nice and still for me. He didn't know that I was taking the photo. I don't know who this guy is, but I do love the way everyone, it's almost like, a school of fish that swim around you. They have no problems navigating around you. So this is also an example of how you can get a fun long exposure, or a faux long exposure, using an iPhone in this case. This was my iPhone 15 Pro Max, and I used an app called Reheld. And this is a handheld exposure. It's simulating a 2-second exposure and does a really good job. This is going through the Everglades here in Florida. I'm on an airboat. We're going through, and I just think it looked a lot of fun. 2 seconds was just the right amount of time. And I did introduce this intentional Dutch tilt to give it a sense, this kind of like fun dynamic feel to the photo. All right, so now we're going to move on to the third album. That's slow shutter speeds. And these are usually, I would say, between 5 and 30 seconds. So you don't need a bulb mode. You don't necessarily need a shutter cable for this. But this is where you really want to start dragging shutter speed to get a conveyance of motion. A lot of times, this is also where you want to start to glass out water, or just get really, really defined trails, like color or light trails. So here, this was taken in Washington State many years ago, back in 2011. And I saw this train approaching this really beautiful bridge quite a distance away. So it gave me time to set up my camera on my tripod. And I kind of guessed This was a hard one because I wasn't exactly sure how long of a shutter speed I needed. You can see actually that I did not time it perfectly because I would have liked for the train to have been through the entire frame. You can see how it's kind of cut off over here. That's fine. It still does a great job. I love this yellow streak over here. But as you can imagine, you really only get one shot at this. The train was not going to back up for me. But again, I'm happy with the end result over here. So this was taken at Bandon Beach on the Oregon coast. This is 30 seconds, and the clouds were moving fast enough. That was kind of I remember this, that one of the defining things in terms of why I went for a 30-second exposure. The clouds were moving fast enough where I knew that I would get a nice kind of sense of motion in those clouds. Also, the water here was not moving a lot. I mean, this is kind of like a puddle, but I was able to get the motion in the reflection of the clouds, which is super, super cool. So this was why I went with 30 seconds. All right, so this is the aurora in Norway, and photographing the aurora is, I mean, it's a very tricky thing because depending on the intensity of the aurora, you can have a 30-second exposure or 20-second exposure, and all of a sudden the aurora will just go nuts and go super bright, and then your exposure is completely blown out. That's happened to me many times. So it's kind of a toss-up. You kind of have to look at what's going on and then guess to a degree. So for this photo here, this was 20 seconds, and it worked out well because I got this really, I mean, it almost looks like this mountain peak is erupting with an aurora. That's why I love this photo. But then you also have this aurora cloud up here. It just looks really great. 20 seconds was just the right amount. It was pretty much pitch black otherwise. So it just goes to show you how bright the aurora can get. All right, so this photo was taken also in the very, very same area as the previous aurora shot. In fact, if I remember correctly, I might have been standing, obviously it was during the night, but somewhere over here or somewhere right around here to take this photo. Yeah, it was right around there. Anyway, point is, this is also 30 seconds, and 30 seconds is pretty much the longest shutter speed that I would consider slow shutter speed. Anything beyond 30 seconds, I would consider very slow shutter speed. But the reason why I use 30 seconds is because I just wanted to get to flatten out the water over here. Obviously, not much is moving in this little village. The clouds were moving fast enough where they look kind of soft, which is nice. But otherwise, it was just kind of an arbitrary call to use 30 seconds here. I could have done something faster and would have been just as happy. This is one of those situations where you really need to study your subject. So I was looking at this guy. I was watching this guy for a little while to see like how long would he generally stand still. I'd watch him cast his line, and then I just kind of time him. And I saw that he would stand still for like a minute, minute and a half. So I thought I would be safe with 30 seconds. And I was. I mean, from here, when you zoom in, you can see obviously he's his fishing rod is moving up and down, but he's for the most part pretty static. And again, a big component of this is how you will present this to your viewers. So at zoomed out like this, he looks static. It looks good. Obviously, the buildings look sharp, so that lends to it. But the ocean is pretty much glassed out, which looks really cool. I really do love this composition. All right, so now let's move on to the fourth and final category, and that is very slow shutter speed. So this is where you're going to have your camera on a tripod or really secured somewhere. Odds are you're going to have a shutter cable, and you're probably going to be putting your camera in bulb mode unless you have the feature on your camera where you can dial in a specific exposure beyond 30 seconds. Bulb mode is an option where you basically will press and hold the shutter button, and as long as that shutter button is depressed or locked in, then the camera will be exposing. And as soon as you take your finger or unlock the shutter button, then the exposure stops. So usually I would be going anywhere from 60 seconds to maybe 2 minutes. I don't usually do super like 5-10 minute exposures. I have for star trails and stuff like that, but usually it's anywhere from like 60 to 120 seconds. And so the first example here, this was taken near my parents' house in Staten Island many years ago in 2011. And you can see this was a 45-second exposure. I was going for this kind of minimalist look. I wanted to use a lot of negative space. That's also why I used the black and white treatment here. But the 45-second exposure, I probably could have gone for 10 minutes and still gotten a really great shot. But overall, a super long exposure here works out really well. This was a very, very moody day in Port Townsend, Washington, and this is 182 seconds. So again, pretty long exposure. Overall, though, I really like it just because this pier over here is nice and steady and still and sharp, but the water and the clouds are just moving really fast. So it gives this sense of motion that I think is very pleasing. All right, so this is downtown Portland, Oregon as well. 75 seconds here. This is the Willamette River. And overall, just I love the contrast here of everything above the horizon is nice and sharp. Obviously, the clouds are moving, but the water is very glassy, and even the reflection looks really nice here. So I'm just really happy with how this photo turned out. And, I think the long shutter speed works well. And for the final photo here, this is 142 seconds. And I was basically trying to glass out the ocean. This is the California coast. And the thing is that I wasn't anticipating the beams of sunlight. This is sunrise. I was not anticipating that, but it just worked out beautifully because you got this really nice, soft, diffuse light. But you also have this very tranquil ocean water. It just works out very, very well for the composition. And so I don't know if it would have been as good if it was a slower composition. And I don't know if it would have been good if it was any longer, because who knows, maybe the light would have dipped away and might not have resolved as much. So overall, I'm just really happy with how this turned out. All right, I hope this kind of opens your mind to paying more attention to shutter speed. I think a lot of times we are just adjusting shutter speed to get a proper exposure, but really your shutter speed can play a huge role in getting some creative results. Again, just requires you to spend a moment to think about what the subject is and how fast it's moving and how you want to convey it to your viewer. Now, this wasn't an editing video, but if you do want to learn more about editing, then check out my landscape editing course called Lightroom Landscapes. It will give you a really well-structured workflow and approach to how to edit landscape photos to get really great and consistent results. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And speaking of Lightroom editing tips, I've got this entire playlist here, so check it out. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And of course, click on the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified of all future videos. Thanks a lot, everyone.